The low hum of fluorescent lights buzzed inside the old, dimly lit animal shelter in southern Georgia. The air hung heavy with the scent of disinfectant, layered over years of struggle, sadness, and fleeting hope. The metal kennels stretched down long corridors, housing dozens of dogs waiting for someone, anyone, to choose them. Barking echoed through the halls, a symphony of desperation and longing, but inside one particular cage near the back corner, there was only silence. In that cold cage lay Blue, a 5-year-old pit bull with a brindled coat, once vibrant with streaks of chocolate and caramel, but now dulled with stress and neglect. His broad head rested on his paws, amber eyes vacant and tired. Blue was no longer barking. He wasn't lunging at the bars or wagging his tail. He simply watched as people passed by him day after day without a second glance. His body was strong and solid, but his heart, once open and loving, had grown heavy with rejection. Blue's life hadn't always been this way. Once he belonged to a family, a man named Tommy and his 9-year-old daughter, Grace. Tommy adopted Blue as a puppy when his wife passed away, hoping the dog would provide comfort and companionship to both him and Grace. And he did. Blue would curl up next to Grace as she read bedtime stories, chasing dreams of adventures together. On weekends, Tommy and Grace would play fetch with him in the sprawling backyard, laughter filling the air. Blue was their protector, their pillow, their shadow. But life, as it often does, took a cruel turn. Tommy fell ill, a rare and aggressive form of cancer, and after a year of fighting, he was gone. Grace was sent to live with her distant aunt in Ohio, a woman who had no space for a pit bull. Blue ended up here, abandoned in this shelter, and for months he waited, first with hope and then with hopelessness, as people walked past him, eyes sliding away at the sight of his breed. In rural Georgia, like in many parts of the country, pit bulls carried an undeserved reputation. People saw only the myths: dangerous, aggressive, untrustworthy. They didn't see Blue's gentle eyes or the way he once comforted a little girl when she cried herself to sleep. They didn't see the loyalty, the love, the soul. After 6 months in the shelter, Blue's name had been added to the dreaded list. It was a Wednesday morning when the shelter manager, Lisa, slid the clipboard off its hook and glanced at the name scheduled for euthanasia. Blue. Friday. Her heart tightened, but the shelter was overcrowded, resources were limited, and pit bulls were rarely adopted in this part of the country. Lisa had worked in the shelter for 15 years, and though she tried not to let it show, the burden weighed on her. Every week, she fought to find homes, to make calls to rescues, but sometimes it just wasn't enough. On Thursday afternoon, Lisa knelt outside Blue's kennel, pressing her fingers through the chain link as she whispered softly, "I'm so sorry, buddy. You deserved better." Blue didn't lift his head. He simply sighed, the sound carrying with it a kind of resignation. But across the country, a different kind of hope was about to take flight. In sunny California, a nonprofit animal rescue organization called Wings of Mercy was preparing for another mission. Founded by David Ellis, a retired Air Force pilot with a heart bigger than the sky he once commanded, the organization specialized in flying at-risk dogs from overcrowded shelters to foster homes and rescues in other states where they stood a better chance. David was tall and wiry, his graying hair perpetually hidden under a worn Navy baseball cap. His love for animals began when he rescued his own dog, a scrappy terrier mix named Jake, years ago after finding him abandoned on a remote stretch of highway. Ever since then, David had dedicated his retirement and his own money to giving other animals a second chance. "Got another list for you, Dave," his assistant, Maria, said that afternoon as she handed him a crumpled sheet of paper. David scanned the list, pausing when he saw a familiar breed. Blue, Pitbull mix, Georgia, scheduled Friday. David exhaled slowly and looked out at the small hangar where his twin-engine jet, a white Cessna with Wings of Mercy stenciled on the side, sat gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Friday, huh? Looks like we've got ourselves a mission." Maria hesitated. "Dave, you know how hard it is to place pit bulls. The fosters are already overwhelmed." David's eyes sharpened. "Then we find a way. Every dog deserves a chance." As the sun began to dip below the horizon that Thursday evening, David mapped out the flight plan. From California to Georgia and back with stops to refuel, it would be a long journey. But David didn't care. He'd made longer flights for far less. Back in the shelter, Lisa checked the clock, 8 p.m., and took one last round through the kennels. She paused at Blue's cage, whispering softly, "Good night, Blue. You're a good boy." She turned off the lights, leaving Blue alone in the dark. He didn't know that, thousands of miles away, a man with a plane and a purpose had just set out to change everything. And as the jet's engines roared to life in the quiet of a California night, hope took flight, fast and determined, racing toward the quiet, forgotten dog who still lay waiting in his cold, lonely cage. The sun crept over the horizon, golden beams piercing through the slats of the shelter windows. Morning had arrived, but for Blue, time felt meaningless. He lay motionless as the hum of the shelter came to life, kennels opening, dogs barking, and staff moving through their morning routines. Today was Friday. Lisa had barely slept. As she poured herself a weak cup of coffee, she looked at the schedule pinned above her desk. Euthanasia appointments, 2 p.m. She ran her finger across Blue's name. Her throat tightened. She couldn't let it happen. Not yet. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and began dialing every rescue group she could think of. The response was always the same. "Sorry, we're full. No room for Pitbulls right now. We wish we could help." Lisa glanced at the clock, 8:45 a.m. Time was slipping away. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away, David sat in the cockpit of his Cessna, his eyes fixed on the sky ahead. His headset buzzed with Maria's voice over the radio. "You're looking good, Dave. Winds are calm. ETA to Georgia is 1 p.m. "Copy that," David replied, adjusting the throttle. He knew he was cutting it close. Between fuel stops and headwinds, there was no margin for error. His mind drifted to Blue, a dog he'd never met but whose story gripped his heart. He couldn't shake the image Maria had painted, how Blue had once been part of a family, loved and cherished, only to end up discarded and forgotten. "Not today, buddy," David murmured to himself, his jaw set. "Not on my watch." By late morning, the shelter grew louder with activity. A family arrived, adopting a Labrador puppy, their laughter echoing through the halls. Another person walked past Blue's cage, stopping for just a moment before shaking their head and moving on. Lisa checked her watch again, 11:15 a.m. She wiped a hand across her face, exhaustion etched into her features. Just as she was about to give up hope, her phone rang. She snatched it up. "Lisa, Animal Care Shelter," she answered quickly. "Lisa, this is Maria from Wings of Mercy. David's in the air right now. He'll be there at 1 p.m. to pick up Blue." Lisa's breath caught. "Are you serious?" "As serious as we can be," Maria replied. "Get Blue ready, he's got a second chance coming." Lisa's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Oh, thank God. Thank you. I'll have him ready." Hanging up the phone, Lisa felt tears pricking her eyes. She moved quickly, grabbing Blue's leash and collar. Approaching his kennel, she crouched down and spoke softly. "Hey, big guy. You're not going to believe this, but you're getting out of here." Blue lifted his head slightly, ears twitching as if he wasn't sure he could believe it. Lisa opened the cage, looping the leash around his neck. "Come on, sweet boy. Let's go." For the first time in months, Blue stepped out of his cage, his paws hesitant against the concrete floor. Lisa led him outside, the fresh air hitting his nose as he looked up at the sun, blinking in the bright light. It had been so long since he'd felt anything but the stale air of confinement. Back in the sky, David pushed the throttle, his hand steady on the controls as he checked his GPS. "Wings of Mercy to ground team. ETA is now 12:50 p.m. Tell the shelter we're on track." As the minutes ticked by, Lisa sat with Blue in the shelter's small yard. He leaned against her leg, his body warm and solid as she scratched behind his ears. "Someone's coming for you, buddy," she whispered. "Someone who believes you deserve a chance." At exactly 12:45 p.m., the hum of an approaching plane sounded over the quiet shelter. Lisa's heart leaped as she stood, waving toward the clearing where David's Cessna was descending. The small plane touched down on the makeshift landing strip, a dirt field just a few miles from the shelter, its tires kicking up dust as it rolled to a stop. David stepped out, his baseball cap shielding his eyes as he scanned the area. Lisa approached, Blue walking cautiously at her side, his head low and tail curled tightly against his body. "You must be David," Lisa called, her voice shaking with gratitude. "That's me," David replied with a small smile. His eyes softened as they landed on Blue. "And this must be the boy I came for." Blue stopped a few feet away, his amber eyes locking onto David's face. There was uncertainty there, but also a glimmer of curiosity, like a tiny ember refusing to go out. David crouched low, holding out his hand. "Hey there, buddy. You ready to go home?" Blue hesitated for a moment before taking a cautious step forward. The sun caught his brindled fur, illuminating streaks of caramel and chocolate that had faded from months of stress. Slowly, he sniffed David's hand before resting his head against it. Lisa wiped her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." David clipped a new, sturdy leash onto Blue's collar. "Don't thank me yet. Let's get him out of here." With a final glance at Lisa, David led Blue toward the waiting plane. Blue paused at the foot of the stairs, eyeing the strange machine warily. "You're all right, big guy," David said softly, coaxing him up. Step by step, Blue climbed into the plane, his paws tapping against the metal floor. David secured him in the back, stroking his head gently as the dog's breathing began to steady. As the engine roared to life, Lisa watched from the edge of the field, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Be good, Blue. You're gonna make someone so happy." The plane lifted off, climbing higher and higher until it disappeared into the vast Georgia sky. Inside the cabin, David glanced back to see Blue curled up on the seat, his head resting on his paws. For the first time in months, Blue closed his eyes, not out of sadness, but out of relief. The long journey had only just begun, but for Blue, the worst was finally behind him. The steady hum of the Cessna's engines filled the cabin as David piloted the plane through a sea of clouds. Sunlight streamed in through the windows, casting golden streaks across the interior. In the back seat, Blue remained curled up, his chest rising and falling steadily as he slept. For the first time in what felt like years, he looked peaceful, his body no longer tense with fear or uncertainty. David glanced back every now and then, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're gonna be okay, boy," he murmured softly, though Blue didn't stir. After a few hours, the plane descended toward their first refueling stop, a small regional airport in Arkansas. As the wheels touched down and the plane rolled to a stop, David unbuckled his harness and turned toward Blue. "All right, big guy, stretch those legs." Opening the cabin door, David led Blue out onto the tarmac. The air was crisp and cool, the sky above a canvas of blue and white. Blue hesitated at first, his paws treading cautiously on the unfamiliar ground, but David gave him time. He crouched low, offering gentle words of encouragement. "You're free now, buddy. No more cages, just open skies." Slowly, Blue's tail gave a tentative wag. It was slight, just the faintest movement, but David saw it, and it filled his chest with warmth. Progress. After refueling and a short break, they were back in the air. Their destination, Hope Haven Rescue, a trusted no-kill shelter in Denver, Colorado. Maria had arranged for Blue to have a temporary foster home there while they searched for his forever family. But as the plane soared westward, storm clouds began to gather on the horizon. The weather reports David had received earlier mentioned a strong front moving through the Midwest, and now it seemed they were flying straight into it. The first drops of rain splattered against the windshield as the winds picked up, causing the plane to shudder slightly. David gripped the controls tighter, his voice steady as he radioed for updates. Wings of Mercy requesting altitude adjustment. Storm activity in our path. Static crackled before a reply came through. Negative, Wings of Mercy. Storm front is too wide for rerouting. Proceed with caution. David's jaw tightened. He glanced back at Blue, who had lifted his head, sensing the change in the air. The dog's amber eyes locked onto David's, as if searching for reassurance. "It's okay, buddy," David said, though his own heart beat faster. "We'll get through this." Minutes later, the storm hit in full force. The plane lurched as wind gusts buffeted the wings, rain hammering the windows like stones. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. David's hands remained steady on the controls, his years of flying experience kicking in. But this wasn't just about him. There was a life depending on him. A dog who had already been failed too many times. In the back, Blue began to tremble, his body curling up tightly. The sound of thunder rolled through the sky, loud enough to shake the cabin. "Hang in there, boy," David called over the roar of the engines. "I won't let anything happen to you." Lightning flashed, illuminating the dark clouds around them. David fought to keep the plane level, gritting his teeth as it dipped sharply with another gust of wind. Sweat beaded on his brow, and for a split second, doubt crept into his mind. What if I can't do this? What if I fail him too? But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Blue. The Pitbull had shifted slightly, uncurling his body just enough to lift his head. His amber eyes locked onto David again, steady, trusting, unafraid. Something inside David clicked. This wasn't just another mission. This was about Blue's second chance, his only chance. If Blue could still trust, still hope, despite everything he'd been through, then David could do the same. "All right, big guy," David said firmly, his voice steady as he adjusted the controls. "We're gonna ride this out together." The storm raged for another 15 minutes that felt like an eternity. David focused on every instrument, every movement, blocking out the noise of the wind and the flashes of lightning. All the while, Blue remained still, watching him as though he knew the man flying the plane would keep him safe. Finally, the storm began to break. The rain lessened, and the dark clouds gave way to streaks of sunlight filtering through. David let out a long breath, his grip on the controls relaxing. "We made it, buddy," he said, his voice thick with relief. "We're clear." In the back, Blue sat up, his tail giving another soft wag, stronger this time, more confident. David smiled. "Tough guy, huh? You're braver than I am." The storm had tested them both, but they'd come through it together. It was more than just a flight. It was a turning point. For Blue, it was the first time someone had fought for him, truly fought to keep him alive. For David, it was a reminder of why he did this in the first place. Because every life mattered, no matter how hopeless the situation might seem. As the plane continued west, the skies now clear and calm, David glanced back at Blue once more. The dog's eyes were still fixed on him, filled with something David hadn't seen before: trust. "Not much longer now, boy," David said softly. "We're almost home." And for the first time in a long time, Blue laid his head down, his body relaxed, his heart safe. The plane touched down smoothly on the tarmac of the small airport outside Denver. The sky was clear now, painted in soft shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set. David's hands finally relaxed on the controls as he brought the Cessna to a stop. For a long moment, he sat still, breathing deeply, the weight of the past few hours finally settling in. Then he turned to Blue. The Pitbull sat up, his ears perked and his amber eyes scanning the new surroundings. The storm was behind them, but its aftermath lingered. Both man and dog had come through something together. David unbuckled his harness and stepped out of the cockpit, stretching stiff limbs before opening the cabin door to let Blue out. "All right, big guy. Welcome to Colorado," he said gently. Blue hesitated at first, his paws lingering at the edge of the cabin. For months he'd been locked away, and the world outside had become something foreign and intimidating. But David was there, waiting with calm, steady patience, his hand extended like a promise. "Come on, Blue. You're safe now." Slowly, Blue stepped down onto the tarmac, his body still tense, but his tail hung loose now, no longer tucked so tightly against his frame. David gave him a moment to take it all in before leading him toward the small crowd gathered nearby. Standing by the airport's entrance was Kara, the director of Hope Haven Rescue, along with a few volunteers. Kara was a woman in her early 40s, her smile warm and her eyes kind. She'd been saving animals for over a decade, but her heart always held a soft spot for the ones no one else wanted, like Blue. As David approached with Blue at his side, Kara's face lit up. "You must be Blue," she said softly, crouching down to meet him at eye level. "We've been waiting for you, sweetheart." Blue's amber eyes studied her warily, but her soft tone seemed to soothe him. His ears twitched, and his nose moved as he sniffed the air around her. David gave the leash a gentle nudge. "She's good people, boy. Trust me." Kara extended her hand, letting Blue decide if he was ready. After a moment, Blue leaned forward just slightly, his nose brushing against her fingers. It was small, but Kara's smile widened as though it were a victory. "We're gonna take such good care of you," she whispered, and David knew she meant it. As they walked toward the waiting van, David handed Kara the leash. "He's a good dog," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "He just needs someone to see it." Kara nodded. "We'll make sure he gets what he needs. A warm bed, good food, and all the love he can handle." She paused, then added, "Thank you, David. Dogs like Blue don't get this kind of chance very often." David glanced down at Blue, who was looking back at him now, his eyes softer than they'd been in months. "He deserves it," David replied simply. "They all do." As Kara led Blue toward the rescue van, David stood watching, his chest tight. He'd done what he could. Now it was up to the team at Hope Haven. But as Blue climbed into the van and turned to look back at him one last time, David lifted his hand in a small wave. "See you around, big guy," he whispered. The next few weeks at Hope Haven were a turning point for Blue. At first, he was timid, his body stiff and uncertain in his new environment. The staff gave him space, allowing him to adjust on his own terms. Kara made sure he had a soft bed, his own quiet corner, and the best food they could offer. Slowly, Blue began to come out of his shell. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Kara sat beside him in the yard, reading softly from a book. It was something she often did with the more fearful dogs, just letting them get used to her presence without pressure. Blue lay nearby, his body relaxed for the first time in months. When Kara reached out her hand, he leaned his head against it, releasing a deep sigh, as though, at last, he could let go of everything he'd been holding on to. Soon after, Blue's gentle nature began to shine. Volunteers noticed how he wagged his tail at the sound of children's laughter and how he sat patiently when people approached. His eyes filled not with fear, but with hope. Word spread about the sweet Pitbull with the soulful gaze, and slowly applications began to trickle in. But Kara was waiting for the right one. Blue deserved more than just a home. He deserved the perfect home. Then, one afternoon, an application caught her eye. The letter began, "Dear Hope Haven, my name is Grace, and I'm looking for a dog who needs a second chance." Kara's heart skipped a beat. Grace was now 11 years old, living in Ohio with her aunt and uncle. She wrote about how she'd lost her father and her best friend Blue years ago, and how she dreamed of finding a dog to love again. "I think he'd want me to help another dog like him," Grace wrote. "Maybe a dog who feels lost too." Kara picked up the phone. The day Grace arrived at the rescue, Blue was in the yard chasing a ball for the first time since he'd arrived. He was stronger now, his coat healthy and gleaming in the sunlight. Kara led Grace, now a bright-eyed preteen, toward him. The moment Blue turned and saw her, he froze. His amber eyes locked onto Grace's, as though time itself had stopped. Grace's voice broke as she whispered, "Blue?" Something in him clicked. Recognition, like a distant memory suddenly made clear, filled his eyes. His tail began to wag, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until he was running toward her, his whole body vibrating with joy. Grace fell to her knees, her arms wrapping around him as tears streamed down her face. "I missed you so much," she sobbed into his fur. Blue nuzzled into her, his tail still wagging, his body pressed firmly against hers. It was as though all the broken pieces had finally been put back together. Kara watched from a distance, her hand over her heart, tears filling her eyes. It was moments like this, moments of pure, unfiltered love, that made every struggle worth it. Blue wasn't just going home, he was going home. The drive back to Ohio felt like a dream to Grace. Blue lay sprawled across the back seat of her uncle's car, his head resting on her lap. Every now and then, she'd run her fingers through his soft fur, just to remind herself he was really there. He wasn't a memory anymore. He was real, warm and alive, right beside her. When they pulled into the driveway, Blue lifted his head, ears perked, as though curious about the place. Grace led him inside, showing him around their home. The living room with the soft rug he'd soon claim as his own, the cozy corner in her bedroom, where she'd already set up a new bed for him. That night, as Grace lay in her bed, reading aloud from one of her favorite books, Blue curled up at her side, right where he used to be. For the first time in years, Grace slept soundly, her heart full and whole again. Over the next weeks, Blue settled into his new life effortlessly, as if he'd always been meant to return to Grace. The timid, broken dog who once lay hopeless in a shelter cage was now vibrant and joyful again. He chased balls in the yard, wagged his tail every time Grace came home from school, and became her shadow once more. One afternoon, Grace sat in the yard with Blue's head resting on her lap as the sun dipped behind the trees. She looked into his amber eyes and whispered, "You're my hero, Blue. You came back to me." And though he couldn't speak, Blue's gaze said it all. "I never gave up on you." Far away in California, David Ellis sat in his hangar, staring at a photo Maria had sent him. a photo of Grace and Blue both smiling under the same sun. He let out a slow breath, his heart full. "Good boy, Blue," he whispered. "You made it home." Because sometimes, against all odds, love finds its way back. It took a jet, a storm, and the kindness of strangers, but Blue was never just another dog on a list. He was a friend, a protector, and a miracle waiting to happen. And in the end, he was exactly where he belonged.